From the Civil War to civil rights, the United States has made great strides to combat racism. This video is made for educational purposes. Unfortunately, racial disparities still exist, from educational opportunities to healthcare access and even access to voting on election day. From mass incarceration to hate crimes down to racial slurs on social media, it's obvious that we still have work to do. Some states have made greater strides than others, at least on paper, but that doesn't mean that this list will be exclusive to the South. The South has a hard reputation to shake when it comes to racism, but the North isn't exempt from this list despite their attempts at progress. Racism in a given area isn't something that can be measured, like population, temperature, or cost. Polls, surveys, and anecdotal evidence can be collected, but that relies on self-reporting. This list will look at a variety of factors for each state, ranging from economic inequality to hate crimes, and yes, this will include anecdotal evidence. If you live in one of these states and find yourself offended by this list, then ask yourself how you can be the change that your state needs. And as always, stay tuned to the end to hear which states rank as the least racist on this list. Number 10 is Arkansas. This one had it coming, given that it is home to the town of Harrison, which was dubbed America's most racist town. Arkansas is home to the Ku Klux Klan headquarters, so it's no doubt that it would find itself on this list. Arkansas was a former slave state, home to 12 sundown towns, which were towns that practiced segregation through violence and intimidation. The towns would literally exclude African Americans from being out past sundown, and residents would use various and often violent tactics to uphold its whiteness. Hate crimes in Arkansas rose in 2020 to their highest level since 2012, according to new data released by the FBI. Like many of the states on this list, Arkansas is doing its part to improve. The Arkansas MLK Commission is hosting anti-bullying training in school districts to help combat race-based bullying in grade school. Number 9 is Mississippi. This may not come as a surprise, as Mississippi has a long history of racism, from its days as a slave state to legal segregation. It was the place of the famous murder of Emmett Till, a young black boy. His murderers were found not guilty by an all-white jury, but it was the 2022 water crisis in Jackson that unearthed decades of systemic racism, which earns Mississippi a spot on this list. While the boil water advisory ended earlier this year, many residents of Jackson still face unsafe water that is contaminated by lead and discoloration. After the end of segregation, many white residents fled to the suburbs, leaving behind its black residents and a lower income tax base. Because of the legacy of racial zoning, segregation, and legalized redlining, black residents in Mississippi have been underserved in the school system and safe infrastructure, hence the water crisis. The educational disparities have also been in the forefront of the Mississippi legal system. After segregation ended, the state considered shutting down its public schools altogether to avoid integrating. By just about any metric, Mississippi schools rank as the lowest in the nation, and that is most evident in the underserved schools in black communities throughout the state. This is, of course, no coincidence, as public schools are funded by community taxes, so wealthier white communities in the state will see better schooling outcomes. Many black mothers in Mississippi are leading the charge against discrimination by suing the state for not honoring its 150-year-old promise of providing fair and equal schools. Way to go, Mississippi moms. Number 8 is Alaska. That's right. We are straying away from the former slave states and heading to the last frontier as racism runs rampant against Native Alaskans. This can be seen in the schools, law enforcement, and housing. Native Alaskans, many of whom speak their indigenous languages at home, make up 40% of the English language learner populations in school. That means that they are starting at a disadvantage while going to school in their own ancestral homeland. Since the Russians first settled in the region, Native Alaskans have been marginalized. This was made worse by the discovery of gold, oil, and other natural resources, in which Americans further pushed the native populations off of their land. Crimes against Native Alaskans happen at a rate significantly higher than crimes against white Alaskans. Though Alaska Natives make up only 16% of the population, they make up 29% of all homicide victims. Law enforcement has been accused of not investigating crimes, particularly violent crimes against Native women. This is a combination of racist undertones as well as lack of resources to service the rural villages that are home to mostly Native Alaskans. Efforts have been made to combat the missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis plaguing the state, with pop culture weighing in with shows like Alaska Daily, which was sadly canceled after only one season, but brought attention to the crisis facing Native Alaskans. Number 7 is Hawaii. Similar to Alaska, Native Hawaiians face racism on a regular basis, which is rooted in the overthrowing of the Hawaiian kingdom. Hawaii was first settled by Polynesians around 400 CE, where they lived in small fishing villages until 1778, when James Cook, the first European, landed on the islands. Since the days of Cook, most native Hawaiians have been priced out of paradise. While Americans from the mainland have flocked to the island for tourism, industry, and missionary work, the property values have continued to soar, and native people are losing access to the land that has been theirs for over a millennium. Native Hawaiians overrepresent the homeless crisis in Hawaii, and sadly, tourism continues to contribute to this crisis. It's so bad that Native Hawaiians make up only 10% of the population of the island of Oahu, the island where Honolulu sits, but represent 51% of the homeless population on the island. There is also a disparity in crime and criminal justice, with Native Hawaiians making up 20% of the state's entire population, but represent 40% of its prison population. There have been many reasons cited for this disparity, including poverty, poor access to education, substance abuse, and racism within the criminal justice system. Remember, if you ever travel to Hawaii, be sure to do your research on how to be a responsible tourist to help empower the native population. Number 6 is Alabama. This takes us back to the South and back to a former slave state. Alabama has a bad reputation when it comes to its legacy of racism, but many of its younger residents are pushing for social change. Alabama's constitution was written in 1901 and contained racist language about establishing white supremacy within the state, with such language as segregated schools, poll taxes, and bans on interracial marriage. You could say that that was a thing of Alabama's past, but you may be surprised to know that it wasn't until 2022, when a vote passed to eliminate the racist language from the state constitution. Alabama is also where Martin Luther King was imprisoned in 1963 while fighting for civil rights and wrote his famous letter from Birmingham. But Alabama high school students are leading a modern-day civil rights movement. Earlier this year, 300 students in the Tuscaloosa area walked out to protest an administration that they say caused psychological trauma to Black students for restrictions placed on an African American history assembly, lower academic expectations, and stricter dress code enforcement against Black students. Way to go, Alabama students! Number 5 is Tennessee. It would be really hard to ignore the state that was the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865 in response to Reconstruction-era policies. What started as an attempt to intimidate Northern abolitionists quickly turned into the violent murder of many recently freed Black men, women, and children. Tennessee made national news recently when it took the unprecedented step of expelling state representatives Justin Jones and Justin Pearson. Regardless of what happened, the optics weren't good for Tennessee when 2 Black representatives were expelled for protesting gun violence, but a white representative accused of the same thing was left unscathed. They were reinstated, but the damage had been done, and Tennessee took a front row seat in the ongoing fight for racial justice. Unfortunately, it's not just the optics keeping Tennessee on this list. According to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, hate crimes are on the rise in Tennessee. Luckily, the incident with the Justins have brought the race conversations to the forefront of conversation, both nationally but also in Tennessee. Number 4 is South Carolina. It was the first state to secede from the Union, a former slave state, and a state that flew the Confederate flag over its capital until 2015. On the evening of June 17, 2015, South Carolina made the news for all the wrong reasons. A mass shooter took the lives of 9 African American people at a Bible study at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. One of those killed was activist and state senator Reverend Clementa Pinckney. Another problem plaguing South Carolina is a thing of the past, but also a thing of the present. That's the state tearing through Black neighborhoods to build state and federal highways. The state has invoked the eminent domain law. The newest project is the proposed West I-526 Low Country Corridor, which would displace hundreds of Black residents. Like in many states, the criminal justice system in South Carolina targets Black men and women at a much higher rate than white men and women. Black residents have their money and property taken by police nearly 3 times more often than white residents. Although Black South Carolinians represent 26% of the state's population, they represent 61% of the state prison population. Number 3 is Texas, a former slave state and home to 9 former sundown towns. One of the most notoriously racist towns in the country is Vidor. To this day, many Black Americans won't even stop for gas in Vidor. Another town that went viral for all the wrong reasons was Southlake, a wealthy city northwest of Dallas where the median home price is $650,000. In the mostly white town, a group of white students post a video of themselves chanting the N-word. The video quickly went viral and forced a town in the South to confront its history and current problems with race. In that same district, the school faced a barrage of backlash from parents when they introduced diversity training into the K-12 curriculum. The few black families said that they were not surprised by the backlash. A similar viral video came out of Grand Prairie. The behavior is argued by town residents to be an isolated incident, but many black residents who experience racism on a daily basis beg to differ. Many Texans are choosing to fight against racism through legal action. Parents in the Lubbock area, for example, are suing school leaders for a series of racist and anti-Semitic bullying. Anti-Semitism is on the rise in Texas, but luckily, parents are fighting back. Number 2 is Wisconsin. This is another state that takes us away from the South. Many people may not immediately think of Wisconsin when it comes to racism, but it ranks high in several metrics. The Wisconsin Public Health Association declared that racism is a public health crisis in Wisconsin. The state has the highest black imprisonment rate in the country. 1 in 36 black adults are in prison, as opposed to 1 in 81 nationally. Black people make up only 6% of the state's population, but comprise 42% of the prison population. Black men in particular are sentenced longer and harder for the same crimes committed by white residents. Those disproportionately harsh sentences don't just stop at black Wisconsinites. Latin men and women are also charged with longer and harsher sentences than their white counterparts. Latin residents also make up a disproportionately large portion of the prison population. Before we get to number 1, let's take a look at some of the states that rank as the least racist. This list includes Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire in the Northeast, Utah, Montana, and Arizona out west. Many would argue that a lack of diversity makes racism less likely, but there are some objective metrics that support these states, such as economic equality, educational access, and lack of racial slurs posted on social media. Speaking of racial slurs posted on social media, number 1 is West Virginia, which is often ranked as the most racist state in the US. One of those metrics is the prevalence of racial slurs posted by residents of the state. Black residents make up only 4% of the state's population. When Danielle Walker was elected as a West Virginia delegate in 2018, she became the only black woman in the state's legislature. She represents significantly lower than 4% of the legislature. Despite this historic achievement, Walker was the subject of violent threats and racial slurs. Aside from slavery, one of the darkest parts of the state's history is lynchings, which date back as far as 1882 and as recent as July of 2000. That means in this millennium, black West Virginians have to live in fear for their lives. As is often the case, we can count on our youth to help fight against racism. One student at East Hardy High has taken on the fight. The student called attention to school administrators about the regular use of the N-word. As a response to her fight, many students responded by putting Confederate flags on their trucks and driving them to school. There was also an influx of the heinous N-word on social media from students. The young girl was not deterred and continued to fight for justice. Was your state on this list? What can we do to keep all states off this list in the future? Like and subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments below what you think about racial progress in your state.